Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, everyone. I am Kadir. Today, I will tell you a bit about socialism and communism. Since socialism is seen as a step in the transition to communism, I will talk about both of them from time to time throughout the podcast. Please do not be confused, as we have provided this preliminary information. First of all, what is socialism? Let's start with this. Leaving aside the ideological aspect of socialism, essentially, it is an economic system. The most basic idea is that the means of production belong to the state, not to individuals. In other words, the state does not purchase your t-shirt or trousers, but you cannot own a piece of land, a field, or a factory. From a romantic perspective, it might sound good because everyone is equal and no one has any superiority over anyone else, etc. But let's say things don't work like that, because everything is planned meticulously, and we are no longer individuals. Individuality is the basis of democracy. That's why communism and socialism are closer to fascism and more prone. There is an overwhelming power, and this overwhelming power consists of the majority. Looking at it this way, it might seem like a bad thing, but it's not really like that. Communism and socialism emerged as a reaction to wild capitalism. With industrial development, the noble and aristocratic classes were replaced by the bourgeoisie. In today's terms, entrepreneurs become more influential. In Europe, the bourgeoisie even started corresponding with kings and emperors because they owned all production and factories. Imagine there was a war. There used to be campaign seasons in advance, starting from the beginning of spring until just before the snowfall for about 5 to 6 days. It took a month. You went to an all-out war, fought, took spoils, and came back. But as industry developed, the forms and tactics of wars changed. Wars with 51,000 people were replaced by wars with 500,000, 600,000 people, and the duration of the war became longer. Now, wars spanning years began to occur. Clothing, feeding, and equipping the fighting soldiers became a huge expense. No country could handle this alone. What did they do? This time they went to the bourgeoisie, to the factory owner, and the factory owner offered certain agreements to the king, receiving privileges as a result of these agreements. In a way, the king looks into his hands. When this happens, it becomes aristocracy. Everyone agrees, but the factory owner needs workers to work in his factory. These workers come from villages and smaller towns and settle in the cities. Since there was no concept of a social state at that time, they had no social security, etc. They settled in the most disgraceful suburbs of the city and lived in inhumane conditions. Thus, many workers died or became disabled because the worker had no value. For example, let's think of a lord, an aristocrat. That aristocrat depends on his villagers. Because he takes taxes from the villagers, makes them soldiers in wartime. They are the people who will die for him, just as the villagers are. He depends on the lord because that lord is the guarantee of his life. However, there is no such relationship between the worker and the boss. If you come and work in my factory, you will work. If you don't, there are many people waiting at the door. As I said, there was a terrible population explosion due to migration from villages to cities. In a short time, the city of Manchester simply collapsed. Its population multiplied in terrible numbers in a short time, and with uncontrolled population explosion, many problems inevitably arose. Engels, one of the fathers of communism, so to speak, saw this. There is also someone else who saw it other than Engels, and that is Karl, born into a middle-upper-class Jewish family. Marx is not actually the originator or creator of socialism. He tried to base socialism on scientific foundations in his own way. He did this because he understood what capitalism was, being a rich child. Otherwise, if he were a worker, he couldn't work 12, 13, sometimes 14 hours a day in inhumane conditions and still be able to philosophize or write a book. Anyway, since Marx saw capitalism closely, he wrote Das Kapital, a criticism of capitalism. Yes, most leftists in our country do not know, but Das Kapital is a criticism of capitalism. Let me leave this as a footnote. Marx's main idea is the unity of all workers in the world and the transfer of the means of production to the state. Of course, when he speaks of the state, he also defines his own state. We will go into this later on. There is no need to go into it now. When you look at it, it seems very logical for that period, because workers in all continental Europe worked under more or less the same conditions. But towards the 20th century, things changed, and the capital owners, who realized this danger, began to give rights to workers. Thus, workers in Europe began to live in more comfortable conditions, and the concept of a social state emerged. In other words, with the emergence of the social state concept, Marx's ideas should not have any importance. But of course it doesn't work like that, because, like every ideology, this is about money. I'd like to put a parenthesis here. In the 1960s and 70s, any skilled worker in the USA could easily buy the latest model car. Even if they were married and their spouse was also working, it was not a problem for them to own one of those American-style houses we see in those movies. Now, can you take this man and say that you will have the same conditions as any worker in the developing world, eat whatever he eats, wear whatever he wears? We must be equal at the basic level, yes, but we will be equal. There is no problem with that. Let's talk about what Marx said about Russia. Workers will unite. But when you look at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, it is actually a peasant uprising. It has nothing to do with the workers. The workers got involved later because the workers have jobs. Even though it is not as good as the rest of Europe, there is an understanding of a social state and workers' rights. But this time, the villagers are starving. Moreover, when Tsar Nicholas does not keep his promises, he begins to oppress the public, and the people revolt. Welcome, Soviet Russia. But of course, that is not real communism. You are right. People try to explain real communism. Let's compare capitalism versus communism and socialism. When you look at capitalism, there is basically a mentality of the more you produce, the more you earn. For example, you produce 1 unit, you earn 1 unit. You produce 10 units, you earn 10 units. Of course, there are some factors determining the value of the unit you produce. But I'm simplifying it. If we look at it in a simple way, capitalism aligns most with human psychology. Throughout history, people have wanted to receive the reward for their labor, and they have received it. Output. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel.